We're going to talk about globalization and social movements, protests and challenges to the global order in particular. We're going to talk about how the topics of globalization and social movements are connected. And in this little lecture, we're relying mainly on Valentin Moghadam's analysis as a primary source. So why study social movements? Social movements represent the politics of protest. It's the way that people who can't be involved in other forms of politics have a say. So, for example, when we think about countries that don't have very well-developed electoral political systems, sometimes taking to the streets is the only way that people can have a say about what's going on in their society. Generally, collective action is a way that people challenge those in power. And people who've studied social movements look at some of the situations that give rise to social movements, and the general idea is that when there are broad social changes going on, and some examples here are industrialization, globalization, society becoming more secular, society becoming more urban, that destabilizes existing power relations. And that situation where things are destabilized empowers challengers. And by challengers, we mean people who want things to be different in some way. That could be, for example, in our own society, we think about the LGBTQ movement of recent years. The LGBTQ people are challengers. They're challenging a societal order that has made assumptions that everyone is heterosexual and that LGBTQ people are wrong or should be second-class citizens, etc. Those are examples of challengers. The civil rights movement would be another example. People of color, particularly African Americans, challenging the existing power relations that said that certain people were second-class citizens. So what are some features of social movements? Part of what Moghadam is doing in her writing is to give you a framework for studying this phenomenon we call social movements. It's a major field in sociology, and it's one of the things that I studied when I was in graduate school. And there are several different theoretical approaches, but for our purposes, we're going to take a kind of summary view as Moghadam presents and look at these three different aspects of social movements. And remember that all of these affect each other. So the political aspect of social movements has to do with the opportunities that come up based on the stability of the state, based on elite stability. Are the people who have a lot of power, are they is it kind of accepted and assumed that everything is okay, or is there something going on that makes them vulnerable to challenges? And then, of course, the political system itself. How open is it? What kind of opportunities do people have to express themselves and have a say in their lives? A second aspect of social movements is the organizational one. In other words, looking at, how do people actually get things done in a social movement? It's not all just, in fact, it's mostly not just spontaneous uprisings of people, but it's based, when we look at it from a sociological perspective, on people's networks and associations. In other words, who do they meet with? Who do they talk to? How do they connect with each other? Does leadership emerge? Are there people who become spokespeople for a certain point of view? And then what kind of resources are there? Do people have time to be involved in a social movement? Do people have money that they can donate to organizing events and outreach and communication and so on? So that resource question is quite broad and includes a lot of different things. And then there's the cultural aspect. What kind of meaning do people give to to their lives, to the things that they want to change, what's important to them. In our just recent period in the United States, we've seen a lot of meaning given to phrases like "Make America Great Again" or "Stronger Together." And of course those are examples from the world of electoral politics, but of course those connect with movements as well. Uh, Also, under cultural aspects of social movements is the idea of framing. In other words, what kind of story gets told about the problems that people are experiencing? How do they explain when people, for example, don't have clean water in a place like Flint, Michigan, or Chicago, Illinois? What kind of how is that problem framed? Is it framed as is it a story about the powerful neglecting the less powerful, or is it told in some other way? Another aspect of the cultural aspect of movements is identities that are formed. When we participate in social movements, for many people, that becomes a way of forming and refining an identity. And let me go back to the LGBTQ movement. People often create or produce a social identity as a member of one of those communities or that larger community through participation in the social movement related to that. Then last, there are ideologies. There are which is a sort of a more systemic or systematic way of framing, of telling the story of what's going on. Now, one of the ideas that sociologists have developed is repertoires of collective action. In other words, there are certain kind of activities or actions that social movements use, and these, of course, depend on the time in history. There are certain tactics that are common at certain points and in certain societies, and others that are less common. So there's a list here: boycotts, mass demonstrations and rallies, mobilizing for regular politics, sit-ins, barricades, conferences, and even direct services. Sometimes those are secret. And I mentioned there on the screen, you'll see the word Jane. Jane was a secret group of women back in the early 1970s who provided abortions to women before abortions became legal in the United States. It was an organization based here in Chicago. There's a little acronym there, WUNC, that comes from a social scientist, sociologist, and historian, Charles Tilly, that is helpful to explain what people do when they get together to do collective action. And it's that the idea that people gather to demonstrate their worthiness, their unity, their numbers, and commitment. And as Frances Fox Piven, who's another social scientist who has studied social movements a lot, these are the elementary rights of a social movement. Now, what about Moghadam's approach? Moghadam is applying a very theory-based approach to explaining specific movements. She's chosen 3 transnational or global movements: the Islamist movement, the transnational feminist movement, and the global justice movement to talk about. And as she says, she is combining world system, Marxist, and social movement conceptual frameworks, which helps us better grasp the factors behind the emergence of these transnational movements. Now, she does a comparative analysis. That means she's applying the same concepts to different movements, and this helps scholars refine theory. And I realize that the reading can be a little bit dense for those of us who are not well informed about these theories. And so that's why I'm trying to pull out some of the major ideas to help clarify what ideas might help us understand these things. So let's take one of those theories that she draws on. World systems theory. World systems theory is associated with the major guy who created it is named Emanuel Wallerstein, and I studied him in grad school back in the 1980s. It's been around for a while. And this theory sees capitalism as a worldwide system rather than as just the relationships within one country. So even though every country has its own class divisions and relations, so between the capitalist class and the working class, world systems theory says there's also a set of relationships among different countries, and these countries are classified into these three categories: core, semi-periphery, and periphery. Now, a comparable idea from other theories, and for example, in our other reading by Steger in the Little Globalization book, he talks about the global north, the global south, etc. Those are just terms from a different theoretical perspective, but they apply to a similar idea here. So you can see in this diagram how from the core you have high profit consumption goods get exported to the periphery and semi-periphery, and then coming from the periphery is cheap labor and raw materials. Let's look at this a little bit more closely. So here are some definitions of those main categories of countries. So the core countries are the dominant capitalist countries that get cheap labor and raw materials from other zones of the world. And you see some examples there. United States, of course, is the biggest. The periphery countries, over on the right, are ones that are dependent on core countries. They have underdeveloped industries, often high poverty. They export raw materials, and they're often previous colonial conquests of the core countries. And you see some examples of there. And then the semi-periphery is the idea that there are countries that have aspects of both of these, and you can see examples there. Here's a map that shows how at least someone has categorized different countries. Now, countries can move in and out of these categories. Okay, they're not always. So if you looked at a country, 100 years ago, it might be in a different category than it is now. So, for example, Portugal, which is right here, this little yellow area on the edge of the Spanish peninsula. Portugal was a very powerful country 400 or 500 years ago. It's not so much anymore. So these relationships can change. All right, the other big theoretical perspective that Moghadam uses in the book is Marxism, and this is a huge topic. I hope that you've been exposed to Marxism in some other class a little bit. But the basic idea in Marxism is that conflict between socioeconomic groups or classes is fundamental to society, and it's what drives social change. Capitalism is our current economic form, and the basic conflict in capitalism is between these two categories, capitalists and workers. Now, in American society in particular, a lot of sociological analysis of conflict, and including socioeconomic conflict, will talk about much more finely tuned categories of people. So for example, if you have a highly paid employee, a managerial employee, are they a capitalist or are they a worker? They're getting by they're selling their labor power to the owners, but they also have a lot of control. So that leads to a lot of great theoretical debate. Now, since Karl Marx was writing in the late 1800s, many, many variations of Marxist theory have developed. There's a lot of debate, and there are many conflict theories that draw on Marx's ideas, but that have developed variations. And in fact, world systems theory is one of those variations. A major modification in Marxist theory is that lots of versions of it today include gender and race along with class as major dimensions of conflict. So just keep that in mind. We're not taking any kind of orthodox Marxist perspective in this course, but it's useful to know where some of these basic ideas about power relations come from. So we're in this capitalist system. We have a lot of inequality and we have a lot of conflict. The kind of globalization that we have today is capitalist in nature and it's neoliberal, and we're going to talk way more about that next week. Inequalities of class, gender, and race are maintained through our economies, and the basic idea is that this occurs within countries and across the world system. And that's where the globalization connection is. So let's go back to the bigger topic of social movements. So in this context of all this this world system, this inequality, this neoliberal kind of framework that we're working under, transnational social movements are movements that cross national boundaries. And the way Moghadam presents it, they are responses to the downsides of neoliberal globalization. They also represent the global expansion of civil society, and they are facilitated by the information and communication technology that has been created, especially in the last couple of decades. And those technologies of information and communication are part of those resources and opportunities in that allow people to mobilize in social movements. So closing this, I just want to show you some images related to one such transnational movement, and that is the World Social Forum is an event, an annual event that is part of the global justice movement, which Moghadam is analyzing. The World Social Forum is an annual gathering of civil society organizations that promote democracy, alternative power arrangements, and it's especially focused on countering neoliberal globalization. It started in Porto Alegre, Brazil in 2001, and it has met every year in various countries since then. Maybe not every year, but I think it's most years. And the slogan, "Another World is Possible," comes from this movement. We'll be doing some readings out of a book called "Another World is Possible If," by Susan George. And I just wanted you to know where that term comes from. And you can see from the images here that these are from some of the marches that take place, but a lot of the World Social Forum is actually meetings and like a big giant conference with thousands of people from all over the world. So you see images from Tunisia, from an Asian country, I think that may be Korean print there, I'm not sure, and of course in Spanish, "Otro mundo es posible, sin barreras." Barreras, yes. Okay. So let's close there and we will pick up in another lecture. But I hope that this has given you at least some little bit of background in understanding why and how we study social movements.